I did think of going to the black castle.
Right, thank you everyone for turning up. We missed last year's Southwest show, so we're pleased to be here this year. I'm going to bring you up to speed on some of what's been going on at RISC-OS Open for probably about the last 6 months or so. So some of it I did talk about in the London show, but I'll be quite terse about those bits. And I'll talk to you about the stuff that's been happening since then, and what we're planning to do in the future as well. So the first thing I want to recap on, or talk about, is the open sourcing work. Now, some people are surprised when I say, hooray, RISC-OS is finally open source, and they go, well, wasn't it that way since about 2008? And the answer is no. So originally, when RISC-OS Open formed, we were interacting with Castle Technology, the people who owned RISC-OS, and say, we really want to make it open source, which allows lots of people to contribute to building a better RISC-OS, and it allows lots of people to use RISC-OS in their products. And that's what we like about open source. And Castle, back at the time, were interested, but not quite interested enough to let go completely of it, so they invented their own shared source license, which is what RISC-OS has been distributed under, until RISC-OS Developments came along and bought Castle, and then we were able to make part of this transition relicensing RISC-OS under a true open source license. The reason why I think this is important is because RISC-OS is made up of a community of users, and the users are what make it rich and vibrant. They're the ones who have lots of needs. So they're the ones that come along and say, I really wish this operating system or these applications could do this thing. And that feeds the developers. The developers want all of this feedback coming in, and they want to develop new cool stuff, but they don't want to develop new cool stuff that nobody wants to use. So ultimately, as they're building their applications or their features and feeding it back to the users, there's a virtuous circle created. And open source makes it's reducing a lot of the barriers between RISC-OS and the developers. It's not super exciting for users to know that it's transitioned from the Castle license to the Apache license. What is more exciting is knowing that there is now a huge community of developers in the world who work in the open source community who will be more receptive to working on RISC-OS now that they know it's a true open source project. And there's other benefits to this, which are, I've been in conversations with Raspberry Pi since before they became a public thing. So I know their CEO quite well, Eben Upton, and he has always been a fan of RISC-OS because he used it in his past, but he's never been so enthusiastic about it that he's willing to reach into his pocket or the pocket of Raspberry Pi Foundation to support our activities, because they are very pro-open source, and he knew that RISC-OS was not true open source. Now, the moment we made this transition, I said to Eben, right, we're publishing this under a true open source license, how about you help us out with some stuff that needs to happen? And he actually supported one of our guys working for a couple of weeks on making sure that the new version of RISC-OS worked on all of their versions of Raspberry Pi, including the one that hadn't been released at that point, which was it Model B, Mark 2, B plus 2 thing? Yep. So that work happened, and it was sponsored by the Raspberry Pi Foundation, which was brilliant. It was the first time that they have actually put cold hard cash on the table to make something happen in RISC-OS. And that was purely enabled by the fact that we could say it is a true open source project now. And the same sort of positivity is felt when you speak to other people in, say, the Linux community. Now, one of the other things that came out of this was we updated our build tools, and the main reason why we updated them was so that all of the license files, all of the bits that you include, all of the header files, sorry, that you include in your software when you build it with our tools, now have the correct license, and they don't keep banging on about castle licenses that don't exist anymore. We also did make some bug fixes and improvements to the toolchain, and this will be rolling out as a digital download for all the existing customers of the tools anyway, for free. But that was another thing motivated by the open sourcing. We've also recently updated the Epic. It's not a huge update, so for anyone who doesn't know, this is our version of RISC OS on a fairly large SD card, a fast SD card for the Raspberry Pi, hence the Pi in the name. And Epic is everything you need to get started with RISC OS, including some commercial applications as well. And for every copy of this we sell, a cut of that goes to each of the application developers. And when you do the maths on it, RISC OS Open, I think we barely scrape a profit on it at all. So it's a good community initiative, and it's supporting the developers in the RISC OS community. But we did make some updates to that recently, and one of the main ones was some bug fixes in some of the Archon apps, which were off the back of some of our Bounty work, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We also put our new toolchain on there, so if you want a cheap copy of the toolchain, you buy a copy of Epic for the Raspberry Pi. There's also a load of other fixes. Another part of our drive to remove all the barriers between new developers coming in and helping create all the good stuff that the community wants was the way that RISC OS was stored. So all of the source code lives in a monolithic big repository called CVS, and it's an ancient technology from the dawn of time. Cavemen very familiar with CVS, and it's not relevant today. In today's world, pretty much all developers use a different technology called Git. And they're used to things being far more fancy and refined than just typing stuff at command lines. They expect to have complicated web interfaces to interact with their code as well as the command line. So we have been gradually working the way behind the scenes, moving RISC OS from the ancient CVS repository structure into a modern Git repository structure. And we've also got a thing called GitLab, which is this kind of website that allows you to navigate the source code, and the community of developers can interact openly on this website. So if you want to make changes to RISC OS, you can register as a developer here for free, and once you're there, you can navigate away, find your source code. You can even make changes in this website, and you can submit those changes to us through the website, and it's all transparent. Your changes and our feedback and everyone else's feedback is all reflected in the website itself. So you can see the comments, you can dig into the source code, you can see what someone has changed, you can see the comments against the changes saying, I'd really prefer it if you did it like this, here's why. This is a huge time saver for us, because we are the recipients of the source code change submissions from developers. And before, people would email us stuff. They'd email it in whatever format they thought was appropriate, which was generally not what we would prefer. And we would pick our way through it all, and then we'd have to send them some emails back saying, here's all our feedback, and then they would make more changes and send us another. This way, when we've got a change from someone, we can just comment on it directly here. Everyone else that's a developer can also see this stuff happening and what the comments and feedback is, and they can learn from that as well and go, oh, well, I better not do that kind of stuff in my work as well, because I can understand why the idea, the philosophy is not what I was expecting. So I've spoken quite a lot about this, and it's not that exciting to the users, but it is super exciting for developers to be able to know that they're using something from this century to help develop RISC OS. And the benefit, of course, if we make it more attractive for developers to work on RISC OS, the benefit to the users is you'll get more stuff built and more new apps and features. I have some updates on our bounty scheme. So the bounty scheme, for anyone who hasn't heard about it, is an area on our website where people can donate money into nominated pots of money, and we just hold those pots and we say, this pot represents developing this new headline thing that RISC-OS really needs. So examples are improvements to the Paint application, or adding cut and paste to the desktop, those kind of improvements. And once the pot reaches a certain level, that's when it might be enough to motivate a developer to get off their chair and start coding, and they can get in touch with us and claim that bounty. And so what's happened since the London show, I think it was towards the end of last year, we announced a bounty matching scheme. So what this meant is, in a short time period, for a couple of months before Christmas, we said, every donation anyone makes, we will donate the same straight out of RISC-OS Open's bank account into that bounty, up to a total of £5,000. And it was a bit of a moonshot, it was a bit ambitious. We didn't think we could get £5,000 worth of donations in a couple of months. But lo and behold, we did. Which meant we had to put in £5,000 as well, but that was great. And that means that a lot of the stuff that was an open bounty at that time either achieved or exceeded its target. And the target is just our guess of the amount of work behind this bounty. Roughly is about this big, and if you were paid McDonald's wages, it's about that much money. So that's how we guesstimate the target. And so here's a status update of what's going on at the moment. These bounties have all been claimed recently. There is one to do with the tool chain, which is really only interesting to developers, but what we really want to ask for at this point is people who do develop and use our tool chain, especially the compiler, to volunteer to be beta testers for us. Because this work on the compiler requires feedback from developers to tell us if it's probably the most complicated piece of code on RISC-OS, after maybe the browser that RISC-OS developers are working on now. But it is super complicated, so it's super risky that if we change something, we can introduce bugs that we didn't expect. So having people test it is really useful. And we saw that with changes to network security. There was another bounty, and I'll talk about it in a bit, but we got the community involved right at the beginning in testing incremental developments of it, and that feedback was invaluable. It really allowed us to slightly change our minds about what we were going to do as we were doing the project. There is some work going on cut and paste and drag and drop within the desktop, which RISC-OS does in some ways. It does it very well. In other places, it's massively behind where you want it to be. And I remember us talking about this stuff in the late 90s at Acorn, and it still hasn't happened yet. But now, finally, there is work underway following the original spec for that we wrote back in the 90s. And this is actually dropping features into RISC-OS incrementally throughout the progress of the bounty. So you'll actually see some of the early features of this work are in the tree now. So if you download one of our nightly builds, you're getting some of the features. And there's conversations on the forum around it as well. So anyone who wants to get involved in testing that as well can do. They're very welcome to. This one's a biggie. File system partition support allows you to use big hard drives and big SD cards now. This is the norm. And RISC-OS really struggles with big media in its current incarnation. It's not very efficient in using large disks. So partitions are the way forward, and it needs decent native partition support in RISC-OS, so that's what's happening at the moment. And there's a bunch of very user-facing improvements happening in Paint as one of the bounties. I don't know if it is, but I would very much hope that saving directly as JPEGs is one of the features. That would be nice.
Not just JPEGs, but
Pings, yeah, all sorts.
JPEGs,
SVGs.
You see, it's feature creep already. Yeah, great. So there are two still open. The USB stack there's some improvements we want to make to the way RISC OS handles USB devices. And that one has actually exceeded our original guesstimates, but it's not actually been claimed by a developer yet. There's over £5,000 sat in that bounty ready to be claimed by someone who wants to do the work. And we will be proposing a list of what the next set of bounties will be on our website very shortly, and we'll be just putting it to the vote. So we'll let the community decide what they would like to see as the bounties that get opened next, because historically we've been quite strategic about picking the ones that we believe are important, but I think it's time we started asking the community as well for their thoughts. Now, I talked a bit about the security one. This bounty was completed recently, and it is the first of a series of bounties to do with improving the way RISC OS does networking, because a lot of what RISC OS has in its networking stack is based on the late 90s and the early 2000s. And one of the key things was the security code called SSL, which was built into RISC OS, which was you could crack SSL with your watch now. It's just terrible. So the world does not use this technology anymore, and we recognised that if you wanted to have a good browsing experience, if you wanted to use your email client securely, we needed to fix that. So the first step of the network improvements was to replace this SSL part of RISC OS with something called TLS. And that work was conducted with lots of feedback from the community, and quite a lot of developers in the community were feeding back on the forums as well and trying it out. And in the end, they shaped some of the finer points of how we did it so that it better suited their needs, which made it more work than we'd originally expected. But I think the result is that everyone was a lot happier with the result. It is based on a code, this piece of code, this library from ARM, and they own and maintain that. So one of the benefits now is every time ARM release a new version of this that keeps up with the latest trends in security, we can just inherit those changes and quickly build them in. So we should be able to start tracking modern security algorithms and avoiding all the horrible exploits a lot more easily than we ever could in the past. And yeah, the community help test. And here's some applications that are using the new one already. So Messenger Profit Organizer. And Recce, if anyone's been down there, go and have a look. There's lots of programs in the community that are already using this. And yeah, the next step is a bit of a whopper, £14,000 target. It's huge, but we've got halfway there. So if anyone has very deep pockets, we could get the other way. But this is one of our challenges, is addressing the kind of the really hard problems in RISC OS. It's hard for someone to do it as a spare time activity, because you know it's going to take several years of the odd weekend. So really, you want to focus on it, but you've got to still pay your bills. So the bounty scheme helps us unblock some of the smaller, medium-sized tasks, but for the bigger things, I think this is where RISC OS developments can really help. So it might be that they might fancy donating towards this. It might be that we operate a similar model where we go after people with deep pockets and interest in RISC OS and ask them to make some anonymous donation of £7,000 and see how that works. So we'll see how this one pans out, but I'm very impressed we got to over £7,000 in that bounty already. I'll say a few words about a to-do list. So we do have some next steps of what we would like to do. We've not got super far along this since I last talked about it, but I want to publish an update that says what do RISC OS Open feel is important to do over the coming years, in roughly what order. So what do we think we would like to see change in RISC OS And some of that could be the way we interact with risk cost developments. And some of it could be, very mundane developer-focused stuff. Some of it could just be ways of training people in how to use GitLab. Maybe we'll launch some video courses or something. I think it would be nice to just be transparent about here is our plan over time of what we're doing. And that helps people when they're donating to our general bounty, which is just helping us to exist. It helps people know what they're getting for their donation, aside from us just coming to shows. We want to do change something to make our development tools more accessible. They're 50 quid, give or take. Compared to the ARM tools, they're about £1,500 per seat, I think. But compared to the ones from the Linux community, which are free, our tools are infinitely more expensive, yeah. So they are a barrier. So a lot of people working from that open source free world will see our tool chain costing 50 quid and say, oh, I'm not spending money, I'll contribute my effort, but not if I have to stump up money first. So we're looking for ways to make them more accessible. And how we do that is still to be decided, but I personally believe we can't keep charging 50 quid for them. So we'll see what we do. Making the source code more accessible, that's the whole GitLab thing. And making GitLab usable for people who aren't familiar with Git is a big part of us being successful with this. So hopefully you will see something over the coming weeks relating to this. And this is another part that's interesting to us in that a lot of RISC-OS is written in ARM code, and ARM code is kind of very tied to the hardware architecture, tied to the processor. ARM is continually innovating and bringing out new generations of their processor, and there's definitely a danger in the future, the medium-term future, that the new generations of ARM chip will not support RISC-OS as it currently stands. And the overheads to developers of bringing RISC-OS up to, say, the 64-bit ARM architecture are high. So our goal is to say, well, maybe there should just be less ARM code in RISC-OS. Maybe we should write RISC-OS in a more portable language like C. So we will be looking to see which bits of RISC-OS can we attack and get them out of being written in ARM code and rewritten in C, or something a bit more portable. And we'll probably try and do that in a RISC-based fashion of choose the riskiest, hardest bits first and chomp our way through it. But that's important to us with our developer hats on, because what we don't want to see is another situation that happened around, I don't know, the early 2000s, where you couldn't get stuff that was 26-bit anymore, hardware, and there was this huge effort, monumental effort, to rewrite RISC-OS and all the applications so that they would work on the modern ARM chips. And we can see that sort of hurdle approaching again with the advent of 64-bit ARMs. And we always want to push our bounty scheme forward. And as part of that, we want to work with risk cost developments. We want to help them as much as we can, and vice versa. It would be nice for them to help us as well. But we want the benefits to be seen by users. Risk cost open is difficult to enthuse users about it because we're kind of working in this grassroots, making the development side of it work. I think risk cost developments have a lot more ability with where they're positioned to deliver stuff that's really meaningful and valuable to the users, like a decent web browser that works on modern websites. And we'll be doing what we can to support them, because ultimately you've got to have all the users as well as the developers to make that whole circle work. If you focus entirely on one group over the other, the circle will collapse. And yes, people continually building new stuff like Pinebook. We'll do what we can to help support them, because where we're positioned, we just happen to generally be experts in the operating system and how it works. So if people need help and advice, we're always willing to help. Okay, any questions? Wow. Blimey.
So, on your new bounties, what's your thoughts then on the 4 new bounties?
We've actually got quite a long list, and if I'm brutally honest, I've forgotten it. Rob emailed it to me, and I skimmed over it and went, yeah, that looks very good, and now I've forgotten them all. There's obvious ones like doing the next step of something, but basically we will present a list to the community, and we will ask the community also to feedback, have you got stuff here that we've missed? But the way we generated that list was by trawling through there is a kind of a wish list forum on our forum, and there's the bounties forum as well, and we trawled through both to say what are the ideas that have come up historically, and especially what are the ones that keep coming up and keep being mentioned. And we captured all of those. We threw in a few that we thought of as well. And so hopefully it is already representative of what the community has been asking for. But I want it to be just an open and transparent process of narrowing that down to a short list, because I don't want to just open 30 new bounties because it dilutes the donations so badly that they'll never reach their targets. We just need a handful, I think.
Have you got videos supporting that handful?
I can't remember.
Okay, it's just
we will have by the
I asked
time.
Andrew this morning, would the new browser support YouTube, and the answer was no, basically.
Yeah. That's really tricky. It's very platform specific to do it well.
Yeah, but it is the only reason I can't recommend RISC to non-RISC people. You can't go onto Google and ask how do you fold up a tent. Back comes 6 answers, all involving run this YouTube. And most answers on Google these days seem to come back as a YouTube clip.
Yeah. Yeah.
It is, to me, the weakest point of RISC is that.
Yeah. Or lack of Wi-Fi, maybe.
Well, Wi-Fi is fine. I mean, you use Wi-Fi.
Different users will come back with different priorities.
But there are ways around the Wi-Fi. There are dongles and things. There's no way around the playing of a YouTube video.
Yeah.
Well, there are. You can, but it's very, 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 very clumsy.
Yeah. Well, definitely, if it's not already on our list,
Okay.
definitely make sure it gets put on there. And if there's a huge agreement that people think this is important, then we'll put it, by all means, we'll make it about it.
I don't get much. It's seemed so impossible in the past that people have forgotten about it. But
Yeah.
back in the early days of Acorn, we used to have Acorn replay of stuff, and we used to expect video and music on your computer.
Yeah.
And now you don't.
Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? I've bamboozled everyone. Hello.
When the RISC Limited stuff went, I think it's gone to Aaron Timble now, hasn't it?
I think so, yes.
Because Paint was already done in that. Can't you ask him if you, rather than developing it all over again,
Yeah.
because Paint had already got export for
Yeah.
JPEGs and stuff. Wouldn't it be easier to see if you could liaise with him rather than trying to start from scratch?
I think that's definitely a valid question. So historically, I think there was a lot of bad blood and burned bridges between Castle and RISC Limited. And I think to a certain extent, RISC Open got kind of sucked into that. We always wanted to be the neutral middle party, but it was kind of impossible because we were operating the Castle version, the Castle fork of RISC OS. So we were always, I guess we were always thought of as Castle lackeys or something, I don't know, or Castle advocates, which we never were.
Remainers in charge of Brexit.
Yeah. So it was a difficult time. However, now RISC Developments have bought Castle. It's a complete different management, completely different people. And I think those guys recognise and value the idea of going back to RISC Limited's kind of pile of development and finding some way of coming to an agreement where we can benefit from all that work that happened. Yeah, it's like the toolbox modules as well. It would be a shame to lose the good work that happened off the back of some bad blood. And I feel like this is the best time we've got to start having those conversations. Is you've got completely new, different people, and hopefully that bad blood doesn't exist anymore. There's an opportunity. I think Richard and Andrew recognise that at RISC Developments. I think they recognise that this is the opportunity they've got. But our ability as RISC Open to inherit that work will be entirely dependent on those guys reaching some sort of mutual agreement, which I don't know how long that will take or how hard it is, because it's going to come down to people, really.
Have any overtures been made by anybody to?
I think Richard Brown has liaised.
I'm sure somebody said something at the last meeting of the London show about the fact that they were at least talking, if nothing, it had never happened before, you know.
Yeah, it's far more nuanced and complicated than simply arranging a conversation and coming to an agreement. There's other factors involved. I'm not really party to all of them, but it's going to be complicated and slow, but we would love it to succeed because we can cherry pick the stuff that's valuable and incorporate it. And it does save you reinventing the wheel, as you say.
Yeah. Like anything else though, aside personalities and stuff like that, as they say, money does talk, doesn't it, sometimes. If people are on a better footing, perhaps that's an idea for a bounty.
Well, I think that's a risk cost development sort of thing. Yeah. You know, that is their whole raison d'etre. They have gone to people who have a bit more money in their pockets in the first place, like-minded philanthropic people who want to support RISC-OS, and they've said, come and join us, pool our resources so we can build a substantial war chest of money, and we'll put it towards these good causes that we can't possibly address as a bounty. Because you just look at how long it takes us to accrue £5,000. £5,000 might not be enough money for someone to get out of bed and talk about a RISC Limited ROD agreement when they start thinking about lawyers and things like that.
You know that person that said about the problem with YouTube? Have you tried using them websites on the internet that can download YouTube videos?
Yeah, you can run YouTube on RISC, it's just a pain, that's all. I do it, but you have to convert the YouTube video into something else, you run it to MPlayer and...
Oh, you do that?
An offline experience.
And all sorts of complications. Instead of clicking on a link in Google,
yeah.
I still use NetSurf to surf the web. Most people seem to have forgotten it existed. But it comes back with a list of links, and the first 6 are normally YouTube videos.
Yeah. Okay, just to put my cards on the table, I fully agree with you. But I'm not going to arbitrarily make it one of the bounties, because I personally think that's true. A lot of what people are doing is, with any computer now, is web browser and videos.
Yeah.
It's a big part of day-to-day internet life now, and RISC-OS can barely do the first of those, let alone the second.
You mentioned life-changing, and this is just a comment from looking on, there was a thing about what youth want in their life these days, and the most important thing is a good 4G signal.
Yeah.
Nothing to do with sports facilities or anything else now. Good 4G signal is now the most important thing in youth requirements.
Rumour has it that Bristol's going to go 5G.
5G will take care of
Oh,
it.
it's a Chinese embassy.
Yeah, a lot of people are just leapfrogging 4G.
At one time, RISC-OS was mooted to be on a mobile phone somewhere.
One of the old brick ones.
Oh, the old brick one, yeah. I mean, it was mooted as being, this would be a marvellous platform for a mobile phone.
It was only
Because it was so compact.
It was only part of it there, wasn't it? It was only like a splash screen and then there's nothing else.
So
Because I looked at it and thought, oh, that looks good. But then obviously he didn't put anything, he just saying what could be possible, but he didn't go any further.
It was lacking a browser, unfortunately.
And video. Oh well. If there's anything else?
No.
No? Thank you very much. Thanks for coming.